Just as Maya Thompson, 8 months pregnant, calmly refused to leave her first-class seat, tension reached a breaking point. Flight attendant Veronica Hayes, losing her composure, delivered a shocking slap that echoed through the cabin, silencing everyone. The scandal exploded when it was revealed that Maya's husband, the airline's CEO, was watching. Outrage and disbelief filled the room as passengers grappled with the injustice. Every eye in the cabin fixed on the unfolding drama. But before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss updates. The first-class cabin of Skylux Airlines was nothing short of opulence in the sky. The plush leather seats, designed for maximum comfort, were spaced generously apart, allowing each passenger their own private oasis. A soft golden glow from the cabin's ambient lighting reflected off the polished wood-grain finishes, complementing the champagne flutes that sat elegantly on the armrests. The air carried a faint scent of fresh orchids, a signature touch of Skylux elite service, while a hushed murmur of conversation and the clinking of fine china created an atmosphere of quiet indulgence. Flight attendants, dressed in impeccable navy uniforms with gold accents, moved gracefully between passengers, offering Dom Perignon, caviar canapés, and warm lavender-scented towels, ensuring every detail of the luxury experience was seamlessly executed. Through the arched doorway separating first class from economy, the contrast was jarring. Beyond the velvet curtain, the airline's exclusivity became painfully evident. A stark difference between the privileged few and the many who sat crammed into narrow rows, elbows bumping, heads turning uncomfortably as they tried to settle in. The distant hum of hurried flight attendants, the hiss of overhead bins slamming shut, and the occasional frustrated sighs of passengers trying to fit oversized carry-ons into compartments painted a picture of overcrowding and inconvenience, a world apart from the serene sanctuary of first class. Maya Thompson settled into seat 2A, exhaling softly as she rested a protective hand on her 8-month pregnant belly. It wasn't just exhaustion that made her sigh. It was relief. The past few months had been relentless, juggling her career as a senior architect, managing a team on a multi-million-dollar hotel project, and preparing for the life-changing transition to motherhood. Every decision had been meticulously planned, every detail considered, yet this moment, sinking into the ultra-soft leather of a first-class seat, feeling the stress of the world melt away, was the first time in weeks she allowed herself to simply breathe. Her husband, Jordan Thompson, had insisted on booking this flight in first class. His reasoning had been simple yet undeniable. She deserved comfort. He had seen the late nights, the swollen feet, the unwavering determination she carried throughout her pregnancy, refusing to slow down even when her body begged her to. He knew she wouldn't admit when she needed rest, so he made sure she had no choice but to take it. Jordan wasn't just any businessman. He was one of the youngest CEOs in the aviation industry, the visionary mind behind Skylux Airlines' rapid expansion into luxury travel. At just 38 years old, he had transformed a struggling mid-tier airline into a global powerhouse of elite air travel, crafting a brand synonymous with exclusivity and unparalleled service. He had spent years perfecting every detail of Skylux first-class experience, from the custom Italian leather seats to the hand-selected menu curated by Michelin-starred chefs. Ironically, it wasn't until now, watching his pregnant wife preparing for this long flight, that he realized the true purpose of his empire: to ensure the people he loved were always taken care of. But despite her gratefulness for the luxury surrounding her, Maya had never been one to feel entitled to privilege. She had built her career with resilience and intelligence, never asking for shortcuts or special treatment. Even now, as she adjusted the silk-lined pillow behind her lower back, she reminded herself, this isn't about luxury, it's about necessity. She needed space to breathe, comfort to ease the tension in her spine, and most importantly, a safe, uninterrupted flight home. As a flight attendant approached, offering her a glass of cucumber-infused water, Maya accepted it with a grateful nod, unaware that in just moments, her presence in this seat would be violently questioned, and that the very airline her husband built would become the stage for one of the most humiliating and shocking moments of her life. Maya adjusted herself in the plush seat, letting out a slow breath as she ran a gentle hand over her belly, feeling the subtle movement of the life growing inside her. She smiled softly, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet contentment washing over her. This flight wasn't just a trip home. It was a brief moment of stillness in a life that had been moving at full speed for months. She reached for the chilled glass of cucumber-infused water that had been set on her tray, her fingers brushing against the delicate stem of the glass as she took a careful sip. The cool liquid was refreshing, soothing the dryness in her throat as she settled in, grateful for this brief moment of peace. But the peace was short-lived. A shift in the atmosphere caught her attention, a sudden, almost imperceptible change in the energy around her. It wasn't loud or obvious, but Maya had experienced it before, more times than she cared to count. It was the weight of being watched, the subtle tension that filled the air when she stepped into spaces where people silently questioned her presence. She felt the glances, the barely concealed stares from a few first-class passengers seated nearby. A man in an expensive charcoal suit flicked his gaze toward her, then quickly looked away as if pretending he hadn't noticed her at all. A woman in pearls and a cashmere wrap gave her a slow, deliberate once-over, before turning to whisper something to her husband. None of them spoke to her. None of them said anything outright. But their silence said enough. Maya didn't flinch. She had long since mastered the art of holding herself with effortless composure, of maintaining a quiet dignity that let people know she didn't need their approval. She shifted her attention back to her water, taking another slow sip, determined not to let their silent judgment steal the moment of calm she so desperately needed. Then a voice broke the tension, sharp, clipped, and unmistakably authoritative. "Excuse me, ma'am." Maya turned her head, meeting the gaze of a flight attendant standing just beside her seat. The woman was in her mid-40s, with impeccably styled blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform perfectly pressed, not a single wrinkle or stray thread in sight. A name tag pinned neatly to her lapel read Veronica Hayes. Her expression was polite, but there was something else beneath the surface. Something cold. Something that didn't quite match the forced customer service smile she wore. Maya responded with the same quiet grace she had always carried. "Yes." Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I believe you may be in the wrong seat." Maya blinked once, carefully setting her glass back onto the tray table before reaching into her tote bag. She pulled out her boarding pass, her movements slow and deliberate, handing it over without a word. She had encountered this kind of thing before. An assumption made before facts were even considered. A judgment passed before verification. Veronica took the ticket, barely sparing it a glance before handing it back with a practiced expression of doubt. "First class is reserved for premium passengers." Maya tilted her head slightly, a flicker of amusement flashing across her features before she quickly suppressed it. "I'm aware," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "That's why I'm here." Veronica's lips pressed together in a tight line. "Did someone book this for you?" The words were like a slap in the face, not for their meaning but for the way they were spoken. The implication was clear, and Maya felt the familiar sting of it settle deep in her chest. She could see it in Veronica's expression, the way her eyes flickered over her, taking in the rich brown of her skin, the soft curls of her natural hair pulled into a stylish bun, the effortless elegance of the maternity wrap dress she wore. It was a look Maya had encountered in high-end restaurants, at exclusive business conferences, in boutique stores where the sales associates assumed she was there to browse rather than buy. It was the look of someone who had already decided she didn't belong before even checking the facts. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest, but her voice remained steady. "Yes," she answered simply. "My husband booked it." Something flickered across Veronica's face, something unreadable but not quite pleasant. It was gone in an instant, replaced once again with that carefully curated mask of professionalism. "I see," she said, though the doubt in her tone was unmistakable. "I'll need to confirm with the front desk. In the meantime, I'll have to ask you to move to economy so we can complete boarding." Maya exhaled slowly, measuring her next words carefully. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, how easily righteous indignation could be twisted into aggression when coming from a black woman. She had seen it happen too many times before, but she also knew one undeniable truth. She wasn't moving. "You can check with the front desk," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But I'm staying in my seat." A ripple of uncomfortable silence passed through the cabin. The tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. A businessman a few rows away shifted awkwardly in his seat, pretending to focus on his tablet. A woman seated across the aisle glanced toward them, then quickly turned her eyes down to her magazine. No one spoke, no one intervened. They were all watching, but none of them were willing to step in. Veronica's expression darkened. It was subtle, just a slight tightening of her jaw, a barely there clench of her fingers at her sides. But Maya saw it. The flight attendant had been expecting compliance. She had been expecting a quick, obedient retreat to economy, followed by an apology for the misunderstanding, maybe even an embarrassed shuffle down the aisle. She had not been expecting defiance, wrapped in calm, unshaken confidence. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this," Veronica said, her tone sharper now, her forced politeness slipping. "If you refuse to move, I will have to call security." Maya's pulse remained steady, her gaze unwavering. "Then call them." Veronica hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was there. A moment of uncertainty, a flicker of something that almost looked like doubt, but just as quickly, it was gone. Her nostrils flared as she squared her shoulders, her voice dropping just enough that only Maya could hear. "Listen," she said, her tone laced with barely concealed irritation. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but let's not make this difficult. You don't belong in first class." And there it was. The words hung in the air like a slap, even though Veronica's hand had not yet been raised. The meaning was clear, undeniable, and Maya felt the familiar burn of injustice curling in her chest like a smoldering flame. She had been humiliated before, dismissed, underestimated. She had been talked over in boardrooms, ignored in high-end stores, seen as invisible in places where her presence was questioned before it was accepted. But this was different. This was public, bold, and undeniably deliberate. Maya's breath caught for a moment, her fingers flexing slightly against the armrest. She wasn't sure what stunned her more, the audacity of the words or the sheer cruelty of them. But she did not blink, did not flinch, did not waver. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "Excuse me." Veronica did not blink either. "Get up." And then, in a moment that sent a chill through the cabin, her hand moved. Maya didn't move. Her fingers rested protectively over her belly, her pulse steady, her breath slow and controlled. She had no intention of escalating this, but she also had no intention of backing down. She had spent her entire life navigating spaces where people assumed she didn't belong, where she had to prove herself before being acknowledged, and she was done playing that game. Her husband had booked this seat, she had every right to be here, and no amount of hostility wrapped in false professionalism was going to change that. Veronica's lips pressed into a thin line, the forced smile she had worn moments ago now completely erased. The irritation in her eyes flickered dangerously close to outright disdain. The condescending patience had drained from her posture, replaced with the sharp, rigid stance of someone who had decided that compliance was the only acceptable response. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side, her shoulders squaring as if preparing for a battle she wasn't expecting to lose. "I am not going to ask you again," Veronica said, her voice sharper now, each word edged with barely concealed impatience. "We need to finish boarding and I can't have you occupying a seat that isn't yours. You need to move to economy." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. unreadable. "This is my seat." Nearby passengers were watching now, their eyes flicking between Maya and Veronica, but still no one spoke. A businessman in a navy suit sat rigid in his seat, staring intently at the screen of his tablet, though he hadn't turned a page in minutes. A woman across the aisle, impeccably dressed in designer clothes, shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck, as if the tension in the air had become physically suffocating. A younger couple a few rows back exchanged nervous glances, but they remained silent, pretending they weren't witnessing the confrontation unfolding in front of them. The entire first-class cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Veronica exhaled sharply, her patience unraveling by the second. "I have already told you." Maya cut her off, her voice even, unwavering. "You haven't told me anything I don't already know. You haven't checked the system. You haven't verified my name. You haven't spoken to the gate agent. You saw me sitting here, and you decided I didn't belong. That's the only reason we're having this conversation." A flicker of something flashed across Veronica's face. Annoyance, anger, maybe even embarrassment, but she masked it quickly, her jaw tightening as her fingers curled into fists at her sides. The passengers around them remained eerily quiet, the tension pressing against them like a weight none of them wanted to acknowledge. Veronica took a step closer, lowering her voice, but there was nothing subtle about the sharpness in her tone. "I don't know what kind of mistake was made here, but I assure you, this is not about what you think it is." Maya's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You think I don't know what this is?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Veronica's expression again. Hesitation, uncertainty, as if a part of her realized she had walked into something far bigger than a simple seating dispute. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, and she straightened her spine, her voice clipped, forceful. "You need to move." Maya didn't blink. "No, I don't." Veronica let out a sharp breath, her frustration now fully visible. She turned abruptly, marching toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she disappeared into the galley. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but the murmurs began almost instantly. A man in a gray blazer shook his head slightly, as if witnessing something he wanted no part of. A woman a few seats away sighed heavily, tapping at her phone, her expression one of forced disinterest. But Maya could see the way her fingers hovered, as if considering whether to record or not. Maya remained still, her fingers gently tracing circles against her belly. She wasn't worried. She had sent the text already. Help was coming. Minutes passed, but it felt longer. Veronica reappeared, her face set, her walk brisk and purposeful. She had backup now. A second flight attendant followed closely behind, younger, more hesitant, her eyes darting between Veronica and Maya with clear discomfort. Veronica's voice was clipped, professional, but there was no mistaking the authority in her words. "Security is on their way." Maya simply nodded, her expression unchanging. "Good. Then they can check the seating chart for you." The younger flight attendant shifted awkwardly, glancing toward the other passengers, her discomfort evident. But Veronica was unmoved. "You can avoid further disruption by moving now," Veronica pressed, her voice lowering slightly, as if trying to offer Maya one last chance to comply. "You don't want to cause a scene." Maya let out a soft, slow breath, her eyes locking onto Veronica's with quiet, unwavering certainty. "I'm not the one causing a scene." A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin, the weight of Maya's words settling over them like a cold realization. A few passengers exchanged uncertain glances, but still, no one spoke. No one intervened. Maya could feel the baby shift slightly inside her, as if sensing the rising tension around them. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She was not going to be the one to break. And then, just as Veronica opened her mouth to speak again, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Miss Veronica Hayes, please report to the cockpit immediately." The entire cabin seemed to freeze. Veronica's head snapped toward the front of the plane, her expression flickering with brief confusion before it was quickly masked by professional composure. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding sharply and striding toward the cockpit, her back straight, her movements stiff. The younger flight attendant lingered for a moment, glancing toward Maya with something almost like apology in her eyes before following behind. Maya exhaled slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They had no idea what was coming. Veronica stormed back into the cabin, her expression sharp, her steps clipped and rigid with barely concealed anger. She didn't even bother with forced politeness anymore. The moment she reached Maya's seat, she extended her hand, fingers snapping impatiently. "Give me your ticket." Maya didn't move. She had already handed it over once. She had already proven her place, and yet here they were, still standing in the middle of a battle that never should have started. But she knew how these moments worked, how people like Veronica thrived on exerting control, on making people like her feel small. She wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Without a word, she reached into her bag, retrieved the boarding pass, and handed it over. Veronica snatched it aggressively, barely bothering to glance at it before shoving it back toward Maya as if it were insignificant, irrelevant. Her jaw was tight, her nostrils flared, her patience worn dangerously thin. "Did someone buy this for you?" The words hit harder than any slap ever could. It wasn't the question itself, but the implication, the assumption laced within it. That Maya couldn't possibly have afforded this seat herself. That she wasn't the kind of person who belonged in first class. That she had to have been placed here by someone else. Maya inhaled slowly, willing herself to keep her expression unreadable. She had dealt with this kind of thing before, countless times, in countless places, in countless variations of the same message. You don't belong. You shouldn't be here. Prove yourself. She met Veronica's gaze, steady and unwavering. "My husband booked this seat for me," she said, voice even, controlled. Veronica's lips twitched slightly, as if she were holding back a sneer. Of course he did. The words were almost muttered, but Maya heard them clear as day. A few passengers had, too. A businessman sitting across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing away. A woman a few rows ahead turned her head just slightly, pretending to read the in-flight magazine, but her grip on the glossy pages had tightened. Maya could feel the weight of their silence, the unspoken tension pressing against the cabin. They were all waiting, watching. They knew this was wrong. They knew Veronica had crossed a line, and yet no one spoke up. For everyone who had witnessed what happened and realized too late that their silence made them complicit. Jordan Thompson's hands clenched around his phone as he paced the length of his office, his breath measured but deadly controlled. He had already made one call, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Every second that passed was another second that Maya was stuck on that plane, another second where she could be in danger, another second where he wasn't there. And that was unacceptable. He tapped his screen, dialing a number that no one at Skylux ever wanted to see pop up on their phones. The line rang once before a voice answered, tight with urgency. "Sir, we..." "Land the plane." A pause. Jordan's voice came out like steel, razor sharp, leaving no room for discussion. "Land flight 2027 at the nearest airport, now." The executive on the other end hesitated. "Mr. Thompson, diverting mid-flight is..." "I don't care," Jordan snapped, his tone ice cold. "My wife is on that flight. She's 8 months pregnant, and she just suffered a panic attack after being assaulted by one of our own employees. Do you understand how much worse this gets for you if anything happens to her before she lands?" The silence was immediate, chilling. Then, the rushed response filled with panic. "Understood, sir. We'll notify the captain immediately." Jordan didn't wait for more. He ended the call and exhaled slowly, shoving his phone into his pocket, his fists curling at his sides. His mind was a whirlwind of calculated action and unchecked fury. The PR disaster, he could handle that. The legal ramifications? Handled. But Maya, his wife, The mother of his child, she was sitting on that plane right now, surrounded by people who had either ignored her suffering or actively caused it. And that? That was unforgivable. In the cockpit, the captain's radio crackled to life. A tense voice came through. "This is Skylux Command. You are ordered to divert immediately to Chicago O'Hare International. Confirm receipt." The captain straightened immediately, his fingers tightening around the controls. "Say again, Command? This is an active first-class route to LAX." The response was swift, unyielding. "Per direct orders from CEO Jordan Thompson, Flight 227 is to land at Chicago O'Hare immediately. There is a medical situation on board. We are currently rerouting all necessary ground personnel for an emergency landing. Confirm receipt." The entire cockpit fell silent. The CEO had just intervened mid-flight. The co-pilot exchanged a look with the captain, both of them realizing exactly how serious this situation had just become. The captain cleared his throat, pressing the button to respond. "Received. Beginning diversion protocol now." With a single command, the course of the flight changed. Back in first class, the passengers barely noticed at first. The overhead lights flickered briefly as the plane adjusted its altitude. A few people glanced up, mildly curious but still absorbed in their own worlds. A businessman scrolling through his email barely lifted his gaze. A woman adjusting her designer scarf sighed, oblivious. And then, the shift became obvious. The plane tilted slightly. A deep, familiar chime rang through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the speaker, controlled, professional. But beneath it there was something else, something that made every single passenger sit up straighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have received instructions to divert this flight to Chicago O'Hare International Airport due to an onboard medical situation. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we begin our descent." A ripple of shock moved through the cabin. Passengers sat rigid in their seats. Whispers broke out immediately. "Wait, what? Chicago? But we're supposed to be going to LA? What the hell is going on?" A younger man glanced around in confusion before muttering, "This doesn't happen, like, ever." A woman sitting near Maya turned in her seat, her voice hushed but tinged with realization. "This isn't just any medical emergency. This is about her." All eyes turned toward Maya. She had finally steadied her breathing, her fingers still resting protectively over her belly. She looked calm, but beneath that calm was something fierce, something powerful. The undeniable presence of someone who had just lived through something that had changed everything. The reality dawned on the passengers all at once. This wasn't just about a slap. This wasn't just about a bad flight attendant or an uncomfortable moment. This was something bigger. Much, much bigger. And it was far from over. The plane's tires screeched against the tarmac as it touched down at Chicago O'Hare, the sudden deceleration pushing passengers back against their seats. There was no normal landing chatter, no quiet sighs of relief that they had arrived safely. The cabin was deathly silent. Every passenger, from first class to economy, sat rigid, hearts pounding, eyes flicking toward the windows where flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue across the glossy surface of the terminal. Something big was waiting for them. Maya remained still, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her breath slow and measured. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The worst had already happened. Now, all that was left was the reckoning. A tense chime rang through the plane's speakers, then the captain's voice, clipped and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be holding all passengers momentarily. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions as we await clearance from security personnel." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The words were carefully chosen, deliberate. This wasn't a normal landing. They all knew it. Then, from the windows, movement. Security officers, uniformed personnel, moving with precision. And, beyond them, cameras. A sea of reporters stood just outside the gate, their lenses pointed directly at the plane, their cameras flashing relentlessly. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended to adjust their seatbelts, others stared down at their hands. A few turned toward Maya, their expressions mixed with something between guilt and silent apology. They all knew why this was happening. And more importantly, they all knew they had let it happen. The seatbelt light flickered off. Then, the dreaded voice came over the intercom. "Miss Veronica Hayes, please exit the aircraft immediately." A visible shudder ran through the first-class cabin. All eyes turned toward Veronica. She was frozen. For the first time in her career, she had no authority, no control, no power to dictate what happened next. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her uniform, her knuckles white. She had seen security through the windows. She had seen the cameras. She knew exactly what was waiting for her. And yet, when she rose from her seat, she still tried to maintain an air of dignity. She smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt, straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. But her hands trembled. She took a step forward. The aisle was narrow, impossibly long, every single person watching her as she made the slow, agonizing walk toward the front of the plane. A woman in pearls, the same one who had clutched her handbag tightly during Maya's panic attack, lowered her gaze in shame. The businessman who had buried himself in his tablet earlier let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming nervously against his armrest. The younger couple in the back, the ones who had whispered among themselves but never spoken up, looked away completely, as if avoiding Veronica's fate would erase their own guilt. They had all sat in silence, and now they had to live with that. Veronica reached the plane's door, where two security officers in dark uniforms waited. "Ms. Hayes," one of them said, voice flat, emotionless. "You need to come with us." Her throat constricted. For a brief, fleeting second, she wanted to plead, to defend herself, to explain. But there was nothing she could say. She had humiliated the wrong person. She had been caught on camera. And now, the world was watching. She stepped out onto the jet bridge. The moment she did, the flashes exploded. Reporters swarmed. Microphones were shoved toward her face. A flurry of voices, chaotic and relentless. "Miss Hayes, do you have a statement? Did you really slap a pregnant passenger? Skylux Airlines has already announced an internal review. Are you prepared for legal action? How do you respond to the public outrage?" Outrage. The word sank into her skin like ice. She knew what that meant. Her name was already ruined. Her face was everywhere, and it wasn't going away. The officers flanked her, blocking the cameras as best as they could, but it was too late. The image of Veronica Hayes, disgraced flight attendant, being escorted off a plane in front of a sea of reporters, was already being uploaded, shared, replayed. And inside the cabin, passengers checked their phones. The video had exploded. It wasn't just trending. It was everywhere. Skylux Airlines wasted no time. Within an hour of the plane's emergency landing, while Veronica Hayes was still being escorted through a back corridor of Chicago O'Hare with cameras flashing in her face, the airline's official response was already live. A press release hit every major news outlet. The company's social media accounts, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all posted the same carefully crafted statement. Statement from Skylux Airlines. Skylux Airlines holds itself to the highest standards of professionalism, inclusivity, and passenger care. We are deeply disturbed by the incident that took place aboard Flight 27. Discrimination, harassment, and violence of any kind have no place in our airline or in our industry. Effective immediately, the employee involved in this incident has been suspended pending a full investigation. In addition, we are launching a company-wide racial bias retraining program to ensure that all employees uphold the values of equality and respect that Skylux Airlines is committed to. We sincerely apologize to Mrs. Thompson and her family, as well as to our passengers who witnessed this unacceptable event. Further actions will be announced as our investigation progresses. The reaction was instantaneous. Social media erupted. People flooded the airline's comment section, demanding more than just suspension. She needs to be fired now. Don't try to cover this up. We saw the video. Retraining? That's not enough. This is about accountability. Teams scrambled to contain the storm, responding with more reassurances. We take this matter seriously. We are fully cooperating with authorities. Further disciplinary action will be taken. But it wasn't enough. People weren't just mad. They were furious. And they weren't going to let this story disappear. Meanwhile, inside Skylux headquarters, the executive boardroom was in chaos. Every division, legal, PR, operations, was in full crisis mode. Veronica Hayes was no longer just a rogue employee. She was a liability. And Jordan Thompson was making it clear that liability would be dealt with. His voice was ice-cold as he addressed the team, his sharp eyes scanning the frantic executive sitting before him. We are not waiting for an investigation to finish before taking action. We are not allowing this to drag out in the media. As of this moment, Veronica Hayes is indefinitely suspended, effective immediately. A tense silence. Then a cautious voice from the legal team. Sir, should we wait to make that public? We don't want to. Jordan's gaze snapped to them. No, I want the world to know we are taking action now. Another executive cleared their throat. And if she fights back? If she tries to claim wrongful termination? Jordan exhaled sharply, barely containing his anger. Let her. He leaned forward, his fingers pressed against the polished surface of the table. Because when she does, we will remind her and everyone else that we have a recording of her slapping my pregnant wife. I dare her to take this to court. The room was silent. No one disagreed, because everyone knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant anymore. This was about an entire company's reputation, and Jordan Thompson would not let Skylux become the face of unchecked discrimination. Not now, not ever. It had been months since that day on Flight 227, but Veronica Hayes still felt the weight of it every single morning when she opened her eyes. The slap, the fallout, the humiliation. It had followed her into every part of her life, lingering like a stain she couldn't scrub away. She had lost her job, of course. The termination letter had come within a week of the airline's internal review. There was no press conference, no grand announcement, just a quiet, final decision. Effective immediately, her employment with Skylux Airlines was terminated due to gross misconduct. She had expected the world to move on after that, but the world hadn't. Her name remained in headlines for weeks. The video of her slapping Maya continued to circulate, resurfacing every time someone talked about racial discrimination in first-class travel, every time an airline announced a new policy, every time a debate flared up about who truly belongs in certain spaces. She had applied to every airline she could think of, desperate to start over. But it didn't matter where she sent her resume. No one wanted to hire her. And, deep down, she understood why. She had been the one enforcing unspoken rules of exclusion. She had been the one deciding who deserved respect and who didn't. She had been the one who believed she was always right. And now, she had nothing. But for the first time in her life, she was forced to sit with that truth. And it changed her. One night, long after the world had stopped actively talking about her, she wrote the email. To Maya Thompson. Subject: I was wrong. Maya, I know I have no right to ask for your time, and I won't waste it. I need to say this, not because I expect anything from you, but because I should have said it a long time ago. I was wrong. I was wrong in every way that matters. I was wrong in how I spoke to you, how I treated you, how I saw you before I even looked at your ticket. I was wrong in the way I reacted when you stood your ground. And I was completely, unforgivably wrong when I put my hands on you. I told myself I was just enforcing the rules, that I was doing my job, that I was keeping order. But the truth is, I was enforcing something much uglier. And it took losing everything for me to see that. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I see what I did, and I am deeply, truly sorry. Veronica. She stared at the words for a long time before hitting send. And then, she waited. Days passed, then a week. Then, one morning, a response. To Veronica Hayes. Subject: change matters more than apologies. Veronica, I appreciate your message. I won't lie. Reading it brought back a lot. The anger, the humiliation, the weight of everything that happened on that flight. But I believe people can change. That said, I'm not interested in whether or not you feel sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change. Maya. Veronica sat with that for a long time, staring at the screen, her throat tightening. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was exactly the one she needed. 1 year later, the conference room was filled with airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, corporate executives, all gathered for a seminar on racial bias in aviation. Veronica stood at the front of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her heart pounding harder than it ever had before. A year ago, she never would have believed she would be standing here. She had spent months learning, listening, unlearning everything she had once thought was just part of the job. She had spoken to black passengers who had been ignored, dismissed, treated as if they were out of place. She had listened to other flight attendants, some who had seen what she had seen and stayed silent, some who had spoken up and faced backlash. And now she was here, not as a speaker of authority, not as an expert, as a woman who had once been part of the problem. She picked up the microphone. "A year ago, I was fired from my job as a flight attendant," she began, her voice steady but raw with honesty. "And I deserved it." The room was silent. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was enforcing policies fairly. But the truth is, I was enforcing something else. A system that quietly, but consistently, told certain people that they didn't belong. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until it was too late." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some people leaned forward in their seats. Others sat rigid, unsure of how to take in what she was saying. Veronica took a breath. "I could stand here and tell you all that I regret what I did, that I lost everything because of my actions, that I sent an apology and tried to make amends. But none of that matters if I don't actually change." She scanned the audience, making eye contact with the flight attendants in the room. "So, I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to ask you to look at the way we do things. To ask yourselves, have you ever assumed someone didn't belong before even checking their ticket? Have you ever ignored a passenger who needed help because someone else seemed more important? Have you ever felt uneasy when someone challenged your authority because you just knew they were right?" The silence was heavy. A few heads nodded. A few people looked away. But some really listened. And that was enough. She wasn't here to clear her name. She wasn't here to be seen as redeemed. She was here because she had to be. Because Maya had been right. Apologies didn't matter. Change did. If you had been on Flight 227 that day, sitting just a few rows away as Maya Thompson was humiliated, mistreated, and even physically assaulted, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have challenged Veronica Hayes when she first questioned Maya's right to be there? Would you have demanded that she check the ticket before making assumptions? Would you have said something when her tone turned hostile, when the microaggressions became louder, when Maya was ordered to move? Or would you have done what so many others did? Would you have looked away, avoided eye contact, pretended you didn't hear? Would you have told yourself it wasn't your business, that it wasn't your fight? Would you have shifted uncomfortably in your seat, waiting for it to be over, hoping someone else would step in first? It's easy to believe that we would do the right thing when we read about injustice from a safe distance. It's easy to tell ourselves, "I would never stay silent." But the truth is, most people do. The people on that flight weren't villains. They weren't all racist. They were regular people, business travelers, vacationers, parents, students. But when it mattered most, they let their silence speak for them. So now I ask you, if you were on this flight, would you have spoken up for Maya? Why or why not? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And before you answer, before you say, "Of course I would have," take a moment to really think about it. Because the truth is, we see moments like this all the time. In boardrooms, in schools, in restaurants, in stores. It's not always as blatant as a slap. Sometimes it's a denied promotion, a dismissed voice, an ignored plea for help. And too often we stay silent. Racism isn't just history. It's happening today, in places we least expect, in first-class cabins, in workplaces, in neighborhoods where people think, that doesn't happen here. But it does, and silence protects discrimination. The next time you see injustice, will you look away, or will you speak up? Because change doesn't start with viral videos. It doesn't start with outrage after the damage is done. It starts in the moment. It starts with you. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that challenge how we see the world. Maya took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs, steadying the burn rising in her chest. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, her voice still calm but now tinged with a quiet strength that made Veronica hesitate. "But I have my seat. I'm staying in my seat. You need to let it go." Veronica didn't let it go. Her voice rose, sharp and commanding, cutting through the hushed air of the first-class cabin like a blade. "I've already asked you to move, multiple times. You are refusing to comply with flight crew instructions, which means I have every right to remove you. Now, get up." Maya didn't blink. "I'm not moving." Veronica took a step closer, her stance rigid with authority, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Do I need to call security?" Maya's fingers curled over the armrest, her knuckles white against the leather. She could feel the baby shift slightly inside her, as if sensing the tension. She shouldn't have to be dealing with this. She was 8 months pregnant. She had every right to sit in the seat her husband had booked for her. And yet here she was, fighting for basic respect in a space where it had been denied to her the moment she walked in. She lifted her chin, her voice unshaken. "Call them." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Veronica's face. Just for a second. She had expected compliance, submission. She had expected Maya to fold under the weight of authority, to make it easy. She hadn't expected resistance, hadn't expected someone who knew their rights and refused to be intimidated. For a brief moment, Veronica hesitated. Then, as if suddenly aware that passengers were still watching, she doubled down. "You are disturbing the peace in this cabin," she said, voice clipped and furious. "You are making this difficult for everyone on board." Maya let out a soft, humorless breath. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat." Veronica's jaw clenched. She was losing control of the situation, and she hated it. A few rows back, a younger flight attendant stood near the galley, shifting awkwardly, clearly torn between protocol and the uncomfortable reality of what was unfolding in front of her. The tension in the cabin had thickened into something suffocating, pressing against every silent witness in the room. And then, just when it seemed like the moment couldn't get any heavier, Veronica took it a step further. "You don't belong here." The words landed like a gunshot, cutting through the low hum of the plane, silencing every quiet murmur, every shifting glance. A gasp, quiet but unmistakable, echoed from somewhere in the cabin. Someone, maybe the businessman, maybe the woman with the silk scarf, sucked in a sharp breath, as if realizing the moment had just turned from uncomfortable to undeniable. Maya felt the sting of it, deep and sharp, like a cut beneath the skin. But she didn't show it. She simply stared. The cabin held its breath. For the first time since the confrontation had started, Veronica seemed to realize what she had just said. But she didn't apologize. She didn't backtrack. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her expression hardening. And then, without warning, she raised her hand. Maya didn't flinch. She had given Veronica every chance to back down, to correct her mistake, to realize that this wasn't just about a seat, but about something much bigger. About dignity, about respect, about the way people like her were treated in spaces where they weren't expected to be. But Veronica had made her choice. She had dug her heels in, escalated, doubled down on her own arrogance, and now, here they were. Maya's voice was steady, unwavering, final. Call whoever you need to call. The words were a challenge, not in defiance but in certainty. A certainty that she was right. A certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. A certainty that no amount of intimidation would shake her. But Veronica was unraveling. Her face flushed red, her nostrils flared, her breathing came quicker. She was losing control of the situation, losing control of the narrative she had created in her head, the one where Maya was supposed to cower, apologize, comply. Instead, Maya sat calm and unbothered, a stark contrast to Veronica's spiraling fury. Passengers were still watching, their eyes darting between Maya and the flight attendant, their expressions ranging from discomfort to silent horror. Some of them had their phones out now, not recording, not yet, but clutching them as if deciding whether to step in, to document what was happening, to do something other than just sit there. Veronica saw it too. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, could feel the moment slipping further and further out of her grasp, and instead of stepping back, instead of realizing that she had already lost, she snapped. The slap came fast, too fast. A sharp crack split the air, an impact so sudden, so jarring, that it sent a physical jolt through the cabin. A collective gasp ripped through first class, the sound of sheer disbelief crashing over the silence like a wave. Maya's head snapped slightly to the side, her cheek burning from the impact, her skin stinging where Veronica's hand had met it. The heat spread instantly, a fiery imprint left behind by a hand that had no right to touch her. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. The shock was paralyzing, deafening, absolute. Veronica stood frozen, her own chest rising and falling heavily, her hand still trembling in mid-air, as if her body hadn't yet realized what she had done. She had gone too far, and she knew it. The businessman across the aisle slowly set down his tablet, his fingers stiff and uncertain. The woman with the silk scarf let out a barely audible, "Oh my God." The young couple in the back stared wide-eyed, their mouths slightly open in sheer disbelief. Maya's breath was steady, controlled, but her fingers curled slightly against the armrest, a subtle tremor running through them, not from fear, not even from the physical pain. From rage, but she didn't react, not in the way Veronica expected, not in the way the passengers thought she might. She didn't yell, she didn't rise from her seat, she didn't lift a hand. Instead, she reached for her phone. The movement was slow, deliberate, chilling in its precision. She barely glanced at the screen as she typed, her fingers moving calmly, methodically, as if she had all the time in the world. She didn't even look at Veronica as she hit send. A single message. She just slapped me, and that was all it took. Maya touched her cheek lightly, feeling the heat radiating from the slap, the sting lingering on her skin. It wasn't just the pain that stunned her, it was the sheer audacity, the complete disregard for decency and restraint, the realization that this woman thought she could lay hands on her without consequences. The humiliation of it settled in her chest like a burning coal, but she refused to let it show. Around her, the first-class cabin was thick with stunned silence, the kind that only came after something truly shocking, something people had never expected to witness firsthand. There was a slow ripple of movement, passengers shifting, adjusting in their seats, eyes darting between Maya and Veronica, but never landing for too long. as if locking eyes with her would somehow force them to acknowledge the moment they were all too eager to ignore. Someone in the back coughed awkwardly, a forced attempt to break the suffocating tension. A woman near the front let out a barely audible gasp, her hand hovering near her mouth as if she wanted to say something but didn't quite have the courage. The businessman who had been glued to his tablet now sat stiffly, gripping the edge of his armrest as if debating whether to intervene. Another passenger, an older man with salt and pepper hair, shifted uncomfortably and glanced toward the flight attendant standing frozen in place, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. Veronica still stood above Maya, her posture rigid, her fists clenched at her sides as if preparing for whatever came next. She was breathing hard, the adrenaline still rushing through her system, the moment playing out in slow motion in her mind. She had crossed a line, but instead of backing down, instead of acknowledging the horror of what she had just done, she doubled down on her righteousness, clinging to the belief that she had been justified. In her mind, Maya had forced her hand. She had refused to listen, disrespected authority, made things difficult when they didn't have to be. It was her own fault. And now Veronica was waiting for the reaction she had prepared herself for. A scene, a furious outburst, a spectacle that would allow her to spin the narrative in her favor. If Maya stood up and shouted, if she became the angry black woman, if she escalated, Veronica could play the victim, could claim that she had been acting in self-defense, could convince the other passengers that she had merely done what was necessary to maintain order. But Maya didn't give her that. She didn't shout. She didn't rise from her seat. She didn't so much as flinch. Instead, she reached for her phone. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost lethal in its calmness. She slid it out of her bag, tapped the screen once, and without looking away from Veronica, she typed, "She just slapped me." She hit send, and then she waited. The shift in the atmosphere was instant, though only Maya could feel it. Veronica didn't yet realize what had just happened. The passengers didn't either. They were still caught in the gravity of the slap, still waiting for the explosion, still expecting this to be contained within the walls of first class. But it wasn't contained anymore, because on the other end of that message, power had been set into motion. Jordan Thompson sat at the head of a long, polished conference table in one of Skylux Airline's executive boardrooms, his sharp eyes scanning the financial reports on the screen in front of him. The meeting had been routine, another quarterly performance review, filled with discussions of expansion strategies, fuel costs, and market share. But despite the importance of the numbers being presented, his mind had been elsewhere all day. On Maya, she had texted him before boarding, a simple message that he had read at least 5 times since she sent it. "On the plane now. Love you." Short, sweet, effortless, yet it carried a weight only he understood. He knew how much she had been pushing herself these last few months, balancing pregnancy and work, refusing to slow down even when her body begged her to. That was why he had insisted she take this flight in first class, why he had personally booked it himself, made sure she had everything she needed, ensured that her experience would be seamless. Because Maya deserved ease, luxury, and most importantly, respect. A vibration against his wrist pulled him from his thoughts. His Apple Watch lit up with a new message from Maya. He tapped the screen absent-mindedly, his attention still half on the presentation, until the words registered. "She just slapped me." The world around him stilled. He blinked once, twice, rereading the message as if the words might change, as if his mind might have misinterpreted them. But they didn't change. They didn't disappear. They remained on the screen, sharp and cold and impossible. His grip tightened around the sleek armrest of his chair, his pulse suddenly pounding against his temples. Everything inside him snapped into focus. "Jordan," one of the executives asked, his voice distant, barely registering. "Everything all right?" Jordan's jaw clenched. Without a word, he pushed back his chair and stood, his movements slow, controlled, dangerously precise. He reached for his phone, the one he rarely used during meetings, and dialed immediately. The entire room fell silent. The executives knew that look. Jordan Thompson was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man prone to emotional outbursts. But when he moved with this kind of deliberate intensity, things happened. Fast. The call connected almost instantly. "Yes, sir. I need you to contact the captain of Flight 227, Jordan said, his voice even but razor-sharp with authority. "Now." There was a brief pause on the other end, hesitation wrapped in confusion. "The Los Angeles-bound flight?" Jordan's fingers tightened around his phone. "Yes, that one." "Understood, sir. What should I tell them?" Jordan's gaze was lethal, his voice steady as stone. "Tell them to remove a flight attendant from duty. Immediately." The overhead speaker crackled to life, interrupting the heavy silence that had settled over the first-class cabin. The voice of the captain, firm and controlled, resonated through the plane. "Ms. Veronica Hayes, please report to the cockpit immediately." Every passenger in first class stiffened slightly, their eyes flicking toward the flight attendant in question. Veronica, still standing near Maya's seat, barely reacted at first. Her lips curved into a smirk, and she straightened her posture, brushing imaginary dust from the front of her neatly pressed uniform. The sudden summons only reaffirmed what she already believed, that she had done the right thing, that her authority had been recognized, that she had put an undeserving woman in her place, and would now be commended for it. Veronica turned on her heel and strode toward the front of the plane, her steps filled with unearned confidence. As she passed the rows of passengers, she caught a few lingering stares, but none of them concerned her. These people didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done her job. She had enforced the rules, maintained first-class standards, and ensured that this flight remained an environment for the right kind of passengers. But as soon as she stepped into the cockpit, everything changed. The energy of the space was nothing like what she had expected. The air felt heavy, suffocating, laced with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease down her spine. The captain, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, sat in his chair. His normally calm expression hardened with an edge of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to anger. Next to him, one of the airline's top executives, a man Veronica had only seen in high-level corporate meetings, was visible on the screen of the in-flight communications panel. His expression unreadable, his gaze cutting through the small space with a quiet authority that carried more weight than any uniformed rank ever could. Veronica hesitated just inside the door, suddenly aware of how small the cockpit felt, how the usual assurance she carried had begun to shrink inside her. She forced a polite smile. "Captain, you called for me?" The captain didn't return the expression. He didn't even acknowledge the forced pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was cold, clipped, and utterly professional. "Miss Hayes, we just received a direct call from Skylux Airlines executive office. A first-class passenger has reported an incident involving you." Something shifted inside her, but she masked it quickly. She knew how to navigate situations like this. Stay confident, stay in control, frame the narrative before someone else does. She folded her hands neatly in front of her and kept her voice smooth. "Yes, there was a seating issue. A passenger refused to move when asked. I was simply following protocol." The airline executive's voice came through the speaker now, calm but ice-cold in its precision. "A seating issue?" Veronica blinked. Something about the way he repeated the words made her stomach tighten. But she pressed forward, unwilling to let doubt creep in. "Yes, sir, she was in a seat she didn't belong in. I asked her to move to economy and she refused. I took reasonable steps to de-escalate the situation." The silence that followed was suffocating. The captain glanced toward the screen, exchanging a look with the executive that Veronica couldn't quite decipher, but it made her skin prickle with discomfort. The executive's voice was quieter when he spoke again, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Did you verify her ticket before demanding she move?" Veronica's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The hesitation lasted half a second too long. The captain leaned forward now, his voice carrying a weight that made her pulse stutter. "Did you even check her name on the seating chart before you accused her of being in the wrong seat?" Veronica felt her throat go dry. She had assumed. She had looked at Maya and decided she didn't belong before even considering the possibility that she did. The executive's voice was razor-sharp now, no longer concealing his anger. "You removed Maya Thompson from her seat." A deliberate pause, each word weighted with meaning. "Do you know who her husband is?" Veronica's breath hitched slightly. That name. Thompson. Why did it sound so familiar? The captain didn't make her wait for the answer. "Her husband is Jordan Thompson, the CEO of this airline." The entire plane seemed to tilt beneath her. The air left her lungs in a single, sharp inhale. She had humiliated, assaulted, the wife of the most powerful man in this company. And she had done it in front of an entire first-class cabin. Veronica's entire body tensed as the weight of what she had just done crashed down on her with brutal, unforgiving force. The realization settled in her chest like a lead weight, pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. She had humiliated, disrespected, and even put her hands on the wife of Jordan Thompson. The man who controlled everything about her career, her future, and whether or not she would ever work in this industry again. She had acted with absolute authority, assuming she was untouchable, only to find out she had destroyed herself in front of an audience who now saw her for exactly what she was. The executive's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, each syllable edged with cold finality. "Ms. Hayes, as of this moment, you are to return to first class. Apologize publicly to Mrs. Thompson, and personally escort her back to her seat with full VIP service." Veronica's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, to find some way to lessen the damage, to salvage whatever dignity she had left, but there was nothing to say. The captain's glare left no room for negotiation. The command had been given. There was only one way forward. And then, the final blow. "When this flight lands," the executive continued, his voice never wavering, never softening, "you will be escorted from the aircraft by security. You will report directly to corporate for review. Mr. Thompson has personally requested your presence." Veronica's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, but she couldn't even feel the pain. It was nothing compared to the humiliation scorching through her veins. She had spent years in this airline, had built a reputation as a no-nonsense, authoritative presence in the cabin, someone who commanded respect, who knew how to control a situation, who never allowed passengers to dictate what happened on her flights. Now, that power had been stripped from her in the most public, devastating way possible. The captain's eyes didn't leave hers. "I suggest you move quickly, Miss Hayes." Her throat tightened, but she swallowed down the rising panic, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral, even as her world crumbled beneath her feet. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly out of the cockpit, her entire body burning with the shame of what she had to do next. The walk back to first class was the longest of her life. As she re-entered the cabin, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The first-class passengers, who had once glanced away, pretended not to notice the confrontation unfolding before them, were now openly staring. There was no more pretense, no more polite ignorance. They all knew what was happening now. They had witnessed her authority crumble, had heard the overhead announcement, had seen the way she had been summoned like a reprimanded child, and now they were watching, waiting, as she approached the woman she had humiliated, assaulted, and dismissed. Maya was still in her seat, exactly where Veronica had left her, her expression unreadable, calm, yet carrying an edge of quiet power that had not been there before. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in Veronica's downfall. She didn't need to. She had already won. Veronica swallowed hard and crouched slightly beside Maya's seat, the very position of the movement twisting like a knife in her stomach. Just minutes ago, she had stood above this woman, looking down on her, commanding her to move as if she were nothing. Now, she was kneeling before her, her face mere inches away from the hand she had raised against her in arrogance and anger. She cleared her throat, forcing the words past her pride. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, her voice quieter than it had ever been. "There has been a misunderstanding." Maya's eyes lifted from her phone, slowly locking onto Veronica's, with a level of intensity that sent a ripple of unease through her. "A misunderstanding?" Maya repeated, her voice smooth, even, dangerous in its quiet restraint. Veronica felt the burn of eyes all around them, the first-class passengers leaning slightly forward, their curiosity now fully engaged. She was on display. There was no salvaging this, no way to hide the shame of it. "Yes," Veronica forced out, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. "I'd like to personally escort you back to your seat in first class." Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "You're saying it was a mistake?" Veronica nodded stiffly. "Yes, there was." She hesitated, carefully choosing her words, as if she could still control the narrative, but it was too late for that. "An error in seating." Maya didn't blink. "An error?" The silence stretched unbearably between them, thicker than before, heavier with meaning. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough that only Veronica could hear. "You didn't check my ticket. You didn't check the seating chart. You saw me and decided I didn't belong here. That wasn't an error. That was a choice." A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. People were listening now, really listening. Veronica's skin prickled under the weight of the truth. She knew Maya was right. The passengers knew she was right. And worst of all, Mr. Thompson knew she was right. A man seated in first class, one of the few who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, cleared his throat. "You know," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "it would probably help if she actually said she was sorry." A slow ripple of agreement moved through the cabin. Someone nodded. Another passenger murmured, "Yeah, that would be a start." Maya didn't smile, didn't gloat, but there was something sharp in her eyes now, something victorious. She leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. "Apologize." Veronica's stomach twisted violently, her pride screaming in protest. This was it, the moment where she had to say the words she had never in her career imagined she would have to say to a passenger. The moment where she had to admit that she had been wrong, cruel, and undeniably at fault. She inhaled deeply, forcing the words past the suffocating weight of her own ego. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I misjudged you, and I shouldn't have treated you that way." Maya let the words sit there for a moment, absorbing them, measuring them. Then, with a slow nod, she finally responded. "Good. Now I'll go back to my seat." Veronica stepped aside as Maya rose, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. She didn't rush. She didn't look flustered. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had when she first boarded. And as she walked back toward first class, the very same passengers who had stayed silent during her humiliation were now watching her with a newfound awareness. Veronica followed behind, her hands stiff at her sides. The air around her utterly changed. The respect she had once commanded, the authority she had once wielded so easily, was gone. And deep down, she knew she wouldn't be getting it back. She had humiliated the wrong person, and she was about to find out just how much that mistake was going to cost her. 3 rows back, a young black woman in a sleek navy business suit sat perfectly still, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet for most of the flight, keeping to herself, but her phone, positioned discreetly against the edge of her tray table, had been recording the entire confrontation. From the moment Veronica had first raised her voice at Maya, she hadn't intended to get involved. At first, she had thought it was just another uncomfortable situation, the kind she had seen before where someone was treated unfairly, but the tension never quite boiled over. But the second Veronica had slapped Maya, the moment that crack of impact had echoed through the cabin, something inside her had snapped into focus. She had seen this before. She had lived it. She had been in meetings where her competence was questioned, in stores where security watched her more closely than other shoppers, in spaces where her presence was silently challenged without a single word spoken. And just like the passengers around her now, too many people had looked away. Not this time. Her fingers moved swiftly, years of social media instinct kicking in automatically. She tapped her screen, adjusted the contrast slightly to make sure the audio was crisp, then hit upload. The video began to spread before the plane had even landed. At first, it started with a few shares. People in her network reacting instantly, retweeting, commenting in shock. A flight attendant slapped a passenger in first class? No way this is real. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. But within minutes, the algorithm caught fire, and the numbers exploded. The passengers in first class were still murmuring amongst themselves, still whispering about what had happened, unaware that the rest of the world was already watching. Then the first phone dinged. A middle-aged man in a crisp gray suit, who had been trying to pretend he hadn't just witnessed the entire debacle, pulled out his phone to check his notifications. His brow furrowed slightly as he read the text from his wife. "Are you seeing this?" He clicked the link she had sent. His face went pale. Then another phone buzzed, and another. The whispers grew louder. Passengers who had previously been avoiding eye contact, who had been content to sit in silence, were now realizing the incident wasn't contained to this flight anymore. They scrolled through their feeds, watching the slap from angles they hadn't even seen in real time, the video catching every second of Veronica's rage-fueled actions. The disbelief on Maya's face. The stunned reaction of the first-class passengers. The sound of the impact. A woman in a pearl necklace clutched her phone tightly, turning her screen slightly so that her husband could see. It's everywhere. Veronica hadn't noticed it yet. She was still following behind Maya, stiff and seething, her hands clenched into tight, trembling fists at her sides. The shame of being forced to escort Maya back to first class, of apologizing in front of passengers who now saw her as the villain, had been unbearable. But it was nothing compared to what was coming next. A young man a few rows ahead suddenly sat up straighter, his eyes darting toward Veronica. His phone screen illuminated his face in the dim cabin lighting, reflecting the viral video that was already racking up thousands of views per minute. He glanced toward another passenger, holding up his phone slightly. "Is this?" He started, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. Another passenger whispered, "It's her." And then, finally, Veronica felt it, the shift. The first prickle of awareness along the back of her neck. The sudden realization that the murmurs weren't just about what had happened minutes ago. They were about something new, something bigger, something that had spiraled beyond her control. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing at the businessman across the aisle. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone. Her pulse stumbled. She caught another movement. A woman gripping her husband's sleeve, showing him something on her screen, both of them staring, both of them glancing toward her now. Then another, then more. Everywhere she looked, people were watching. Not at her, at their screens. Veronica's breath hitched. No, no, no. She yanked her own phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking slightly as she unlocked the screen. The moment the home screen loaded, she saw it. A notification flood. Her name, trending. Her brain barely processed the words on the screen as she scrolled through her mentions. Hundreds, no, thousands, comments, messages, reactions. Fire her immediately. This is disgusting. I hope she never works again. Skylarks Airlines, do you have a statement, because this is going viral? Veronica felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers moved to the search bar, typing her own name with a morbid kind of desperation. There it was, her name, the video, the moment she had raised her hand and struck Maya, captured with perfect clarity, replayed over and over again. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. This wasn't just about her job. This was about her entire career. The reality crashed over her, wave after crushing wave. This was not going away. This was not something that could be brushed under the rug, written off as a misunderstanding, hidden behind an official statement of apology. She had been caught. Fully, completely, undeniably. And the world was already demanding her head. She swallowed hard, her vision blurring for just a second, her hands gripping her phone with white-knuckled force. Maya hadn't even looked back at her yet. She was still walking toward her seat, still moving with that same effortless composure, still carrying herself with the quiet kind of power that made Veronica want to scream. Because now, the entire world was on Maya's side. And Veronica? She was finished. Maya had held herself together through all of it. The humiliation, the disbelief, the quiet rage simmering beneath her skin. She had sat through Veronica's condescending interrogation. She had endured the slap. She had refused to be rattled by the forced apology. She had kept her composure because she had learned long ago that the moment she lost control, she would become the problem. That was how the world worked for women like her. If she yelled, she was aggressive. If she cried, she was weak. If she fought back, she was unprofessional. But as she reached her seat, as the weight of everything finally settled in her chest, her body betrayed her. A sharp, sudden pain gripped her abdomen. Maya's breath hitched. Her fingers instinctively flew to her belly, pressing lightly against the fabric of her dress as panic began to creep in. Her heart was pounding too fast, too hard, each beat a violent thud in her chest, rattling against her ribcage like it was trying to escape. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, too thick, like she was drowning in it instead of inhaling it. Her vision blurred for a moment, colors smearing together in a way that made the entire cabin feel unstable. The murmurs around her, the quiet gasps of passengers still reacting to the viral video, became a low, distant hum, like she was underwater, drifting further and further from reality. A hand touched her shoulder. Maya. It was soft, hesitant, but it shattered something inside her. The walls she had built around herself, the years of holding everything in, of keeping herself composed, of refusing to show weakness in spaces where she was already seen as lesser, it all collapsed. She let out a sharp, ragged breath, but it didn't feel like enough. Her chest tightened. The pain in her stomach flared. Her hand clutched her belly tighter, fingers trembling as her body locked up, as fear took hold. And then her knees buckled. A woman screamed. "Oh my God, she's collapsing." A rush of movement, voices shouting. Someone called for help. Someone else fumbled with the call button above their seat, pressing it frantically. The hum of whispers that had filled first class turned into full-blown chaos. Maya couldn't focus on any of it. She was falling. Not physically, not yet, but into something dark and terrifying, something she couldn't control. She was barely aware of the hands grabbing her arms, barely aware of someone easing her into a seat, barely aware of the panic in the air around her. Then, a voice, firm, commanding, cutting through the fog. "Move, I'm a doctor." A figure pushed through the small crowd forming around Maya. A middle-aged man with sharp, focused eyes and a navy blazer that looked slightly rumpled from travel knelt in front of her, his hands steady, his presence grounding. "She's hyperventilating," he said, voice calm but urgent. "Maya, listen to me. You need to slow your breathing. Right now, you're taking in too much air too quickly. I need you to focus on my voice." Maya tried. She really did. But her chest was so tight, so heavy, like it was caving in on itself. The doctor reached for her wrist, checking her pulse. His brows furrowed. "She's tachycardic. We need to get her calm before this worsens. A trembling voice spoke from behind him. Is she going into labor? Maya's breath hitched violently, a fresh wave of fear crashing into her. The doctor snapped his head toward the flight attendant who had spoken. Don't say that. You'll only make her panic more. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, willing the world to stop spinning, willing her body to cooperate, willing the fear to loosen its grip. Another contraction of pain shot through her stomach. Not labor, not yet, but stress, extreme stress, was dangerous. She needed to calm down. She needed to breathe. The doctor touched her knee lightly. Maya, open your eyes. She did, barely. I need you to match my breathing, all right? Just focus on me. He took a slow, exaggerated inhale through his nose, holding it for a beat before exhaling through his mouth. In, hold, out. Maya tried. Her breath still hitched, still felt like it was too much, not enough, all at once. But she kept trying, and slowly, bit by bit, the tightness in her chest began to ease. The dizziness receded. The burning in her throat dulled. She could breathe again. The doctor nodded, keeping his eyes locked on hers. Good. Just keep going. In, hold, out. Maya's hand was still gripping her belly, but the pain was fading now, the worst of it passing like an aftershock of an earthquake. Then, for the first time since this nightmare began, she became fully aware of the silence surrounding her. She looked up. The passengers, the ones who had sat quietly while she was being mistreated, who had whispered among themselves while she was being humiliated, were staring at her now with something different in their eyes. Guilt. A woman in pearls clutched her handbag, her lips pressed together as if holding back tears. The businessman who had buried himself in his tablet earlier now looked deeply ashamed, his fingers curled into a loose fist against his knee. The younger couple, who had stayed silent the entire flight, looked absolutely horrified. They hadn't done anything before. They hadn't spoken up. And now, they were realizing just how much that silence had cost. A man in the back of first class whispered, voice almost hoarse, "She's pregnant, for God's sake." Another murmured, "We should have stopped it earlier." A woman near the front, voice shaky, "We let it happen." Maya swallowed hard, her throat raw, her emotions so tangled she couldn't even process them all at once. Veronica was nowhere to be seen. Maya didn't have the energy to care. The doctor gave her a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "Do you feel stable now?" She nodded weakly. He hesitated. "You should be checked as soon as we land, just to be safe." "I will," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor let out a slow breath, nodding before rising to his feet. "Someone get her water." The same passengers who had once ignored her suffering were now scrambling to help. Someone handed her a bottle, their hands shaking slightly as they placed it in her lap. She took it, gripping the cool plastic tightly, grounding herself with the sensation. The plane was still flying. The world was still moving. But everything had changed. Not just for her.